Welcome. Right now we are hosting three artists, Angela Neubauer, Felix, Lenz, and Eszter Zwickl. And they are actually they all came from Vienna to us and are studying at the University of Applied Art in Vienna. Upstairs we have one of their works at our exhibition, Cleanroom Paradox, and it's a very interesting piece. I recommend you going upstairs, seeing it afterwards. It actually uncovers to us what's hidden behind creating of all the new technologies that you are holding in your hands or using on daily basis. Maybe after this talk you will also be able to rethink what and how we use these new media, new technologies. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for inviting us, and sorry also for the technical difficulties. So we will start with some insights into the rather extensive research we conducted for our installation, the Cleanroom Paradox. And we will then gradually get more general, attempting to deconstruct the tools, tactics, and strategies the industry employs to exploit their workers, attenuate their sovereignty, and also impede union formation. And we will also give a glimpse into the historic dimensions of the industry's latent practices, showing that many of those strategies are in fact uncanny echoes from the past. And then in the end, we will try to jointly discuss counter-strategies to redistribute power hierarchies in the industry. So starting with the semiconductor industry, where our project, the Cleanroom Paradox, very much focused on. I mean, we of course cordially invite you to see our installation after our lecture, and quickly summarizing what the work consisted of in more general terms. It's basically consists of gradually disintegrating custom-made print and a video essay. And for our work, during the course of our research, we got in touch with Jin. That's her pseudonym, and she is a former Samsung factory worker from Korea. And unfortunately, she suffered from kidney cancer after chemical and radiation exposure in one of Samsung factory plants, the so-called clean rooms. And she was kind enough to send us a self-portrait that she has taken with her Samsung phone. And after thinking about how to best convey her story, we decided to make a custom ink out of also dissolved, chemically disintegrated Samsung phones. Here you can see a couple of pictures how our process looked like. And finally, we ended up with this rather black, gooey-ish ink. And we consequently screen printed Jin's portrait with this custom-made ink. And conceptually important to us was that due to the toxic and rather acidic properties of the ink, the print would gradually disintegrate. So similar to the workers' bodies being affected over the course of several years by the chemicals and also radiation in those factory sites, the print would also disintegrate over time. And we're going to show you a minute of trailer for our movie as a teaser. I hope the audio works. Yes.
My friend working in your company died with breast cancer. Her age is young. Many women have breast cancer, you know, but young women having breast cancer is very rare. So I suppose very strongly it is related with working condition. etching materials, HF or hydrogen fluoride or hydrogen sulfide can be used, and it is very toxic.
화학물질이라고 하면 지금 생각나는 건 오론가스, 포스펜가스, 아르세닉.
Most materials are supposed to be carcinogens, mutagens, and it can be very, very harmful for human bodies.
So yeah, as you might have realized by now, it's quite important to understand that this industry is not just electronics, but rather relies very heavily on chemicals, and that it's actually chemicals that is the major substance that is used for manufacturing our chips for smartphones, cars, etc., all our everyday devices. And I think the reason why we ended up doing or having this doing this artistic experiment was that we observed there to be a rather dichotomous relationship between the way high-tech devices are advertised and also publicly perceived and the environmental and social context inscribed in those devices. So we very much wanted to contrast the shiny glass and alloy designs and finish of those products with the aesthetics of our rather black, gooey ink, which more accurately resembled the actual context inscribed into those devices. And as another former semiconductor factory worker wrote, I've seen the chemical info on the equipment before and it literally says slurry, because there are so many different chemicals mixed together that they don't list them at all. And that was yet another reason why the aesthetics of this ink that rather resembled a slurry-like mass to us resonated with us. And there's yet another paradox we observed during our research, summarized by a quote from Dr. Richard Clapp that we interviewed some time ago. He said, the workers in the clean rooms have to wear protective clothing to keep dust and dandruff even off the semiconductors, but they still breathe the chemicals. So it's a clean room for the product, but not for the workers. And the very products we are speaking of have silicon wafers at its heart. So the silicon wafers are very much the basis of every chip. And to manufacture them, chemicals and light combine to photographically print circuits onto silicon wafers. And this process is very similar to the screen printing process, why we actually decided to superimpose those processes in our video. But the chemical cocktails used in this process are very dangerous. And they are particularly dangerous for women, dramatically raising infertility and miscarriage rates, as we will hear later. But the issue is, this is not just a Southeast Asian issue. It actually very much has its origin in the West. And to make the point clear, there's one story of the Synetics 3, they are called. So the Synetics Corporation was a major Silicon Valley player in the 70s. They manufactured semiconductors for military, but also business and consumer markets. And in 1978, several female employees informed the management about noxious fumes in the factory plant. And the women experienced dizziness, nausea, mental confusion, and also emotional problems. But the management said they have something what they termed assembly line hysteria. And only after the male employees finally reported similar problems, they started to investigate the issue, and they did so by sending the 3 most significantly affected women of the factory around the plant like canaries in a coal mine. And those 3 women later got known as the Synetics 3. They also got fired by the company shortly after. And a few years after, the US Environmental Protection Agency designated the property of this very corporation Federal Toxic Superfund site, which is a location that needs a long-term response to clean up hazardous material and usually can't be cleaned up that easily. So in this graphic, we see how Superfund sites are laid out across California, so where also Silicon Valley is based. Santa Clara County is now home to 29 Superfund sites, which is more than in any other county to the nation. And 24 of those are the result of pollution by electronic firms. So back in the 60s, the post-industrial and rather campus-like planning made it quite easy for the developers to claim the industry was very clean and pollution-free. But in fact, as we realize by now probably, the industry has just buried its smokestacks on the ground. And to also make clear that many of the issues we heard of are indeed just uncanny echoes from the past, I will lay out some of the historical context in this chapter. So Silicon Valley is based on the land that once belonged to the Ohlone Costanian people, which have been living in what is today California for roughly 15,000 years before the arrival of Spanish explorers too. And those indigenous tribes, immigrants, people of color and women are still there and still are very much at the center of environmental justice conflicts in Silicon Valley. Then in 1769, the first Spanish missions and explorers arrived, and the Ohlone population in northern California declined from 11,000 to only 2,000 people by 1830. So here again, gender mattered actually a great deal. Women in particular were singled out and often experienced quite sadistic and cruel treatment during that time. And as we can see when we overlay the Superfund sites that I showed you earlier with the map of the first missions, there are quite some parallels on the locations where the Superfund sites are located nowadays. So in the next era, we find ourselves in the era of the gold rush that happened from 1848 onwards. And it's important to note this because this was the first form of chemical exposure in Santa Clara County, because they opened a quicksilver mine where Silicon Valley is today in San Jose. And the issue with quicksilver is that they needed it for extracting gold and silver from raw ore, but it bioaccumulates and poisons water and also the rivers. So now we find ourselves with the legacy of 75% of the people fishing in San Francisco still being people of color, and they are still exposed to this form of toxic pollution that happened several decades earlier. Important also is to point out that Stanford University has been very much at the core of the transformation from Santa Clara into Silicon Valley. The founder of Stanford University actually already made a fortune in the gold rush. And then during the Cold War, the US Defense Agency made huge investments in the industry and for military research. And as a result, the Stanford Industrial Park was founded, which later leased a lot of land to electronic firms. So this is important to highlight because the industry did not just start from scratch or mere brain power, it basically started from military funding. And in 1981, this whole illusion of the clean industry finally started to crumble when people realized that over 16,000 homes in south of San Jose were contaminated with a deadly chemical. And when this got public, the industries very quickly shifted away from white communities towards lower income and communities of color. And yet a decade later, a couple of independent studies uncovered further forms of toxic exposure, and then there was actually the first time when some of those chemicals got classified and the industry promised to phase out some of the chemicals over the next years. But what we realized, or what happened then quite quickly after that, is that the industry merely shifted its areas of production to the south, to areas that were less expensive, so mainly Southeast Asian countries. And in those countries, they are still using the very same chemicals that were in use already decades later in Silicon Valley, because they are simply cheaper, more abundantly available, and less expensive than less dangerous alternatives.
So yeah, we were talking a lot about it. People are getting affected with those chemicals. So I'm just going to guide you through a bit how a worker's workday look like and how they are exactly getting in touch with the chemicals. So the workday starts with a so-called air shower for the workers. When they put their protective equipment on, which was already discussed, is not protective for the workers, but it's protective for the chips, they're going to the air shower. Air shower is basically runs through a lot of air in your protective equipment, and all of the dust or your eyelashes or your hair just falls into the ground, so there is no dirt in your clothes. After that, there is the 5-minute clean happening, where people are basically cleaning desks or the floor from dust and dandruff. It is very important because those small particles can disturb the process of chip making. So if it happened, they need to start it again. So the workers are in contact with different kinds of chemicals throughout their work shifts, and those chemicals are interfering with the body in different ways. For example, it can melt gloves. And we have a quote here from Jin, who we interviewed. "We worked with plastic gloves on, but while we worked, holes were made. So I used to change gloves, but there was a case where it smeared in the meantime." So there are very visible ways how chemicals are interfering with the body, but there are also interference that people can only experience sometime later, because those chemicals can create cancer, birth defects on newborns, miscarriages, even infertility, and those issues are only appearing after several years, so sometimes it's not even related to, so sometimes people cannot even put the connections together in their heads that it's related to work because they got their diagnosed after they retired, for example. And yes, in this picture you can see Kim Myeon and her daughter Yubin, and Kim later suffered from infertility and uterine cancer. And many people, after they got their diagnosis, are turning to their companies and try to ask them for some declarations. And most of them, it ends up with some denial from the part of the company. In 1980s, chemists at IBM's San Jose plant wrote a letter to IBM's medical staff about the fact that 8 of his 9 co-workers are suffering from cancer, 4 of them with brain cancer, which is one of the rarest cancers. He even stated the names, the type of cancers they are having, and the chemicals they were handling. The answer was, from the medical staff, "Cancer is a very unfortunate fact of life, and there is nothing pointed to the exposure of work." After his 4th co-worker died from cancer, from the 9 co-worker he had, he even wrote a letter to IBM's chairman at the time, and he got the answer back, "Regrettably, cancer is one of the most common causes of death in American adults." So after the company denies that they have something to do with the illness, many people are turning to go to legal action. And after working for IBM between the 70s and 80s, altogether 250 people or their families sued IBM. But most cases ended up in favor to IBM, and the people got nothing. Why is that? All chemicals that one manufacturing plant is using are part of the semiconductors company's trade secret. So some people are not even aware of what chemicals they are working with or how it can affect their health. One of IBM's worker in the 80s handled gallons of KTI per day, and he suffered later testicular cancer. KTI is a chemical. KTI officially should have a label on it which says it may cause damage for the testicles. This worker claimed that he never even saw this sign. So when the lawsuit against IBM started in the early 2000s, they found that IBM kept record of their dead employees since 1969. It was called the corporate mortality file. No one knew about it before. As a part of the lawsuit, Dr. Richard Klepp, epidemiologist, who we also interviewed for our research, was hired by a lawyer against IBM to analyze this corporate mortality file. He found out that cancer rate at IBM is higher than national average For example, for brain cancer, 4 times more, for breast cancer, 2 times more. Klepp was never able to tell what he found out in court because a decision was already made in favor for IBM. Dr. Klepp and his research partner, Dr. Johnson, wanted to publish this research after it was not used for the trial, but IBM made it impossible for them, and their reason was that it's confidential information and it's only existing because of the trial, so many publishers turned them down because of that. So they needed 2 years of trying where they were finally able to publish it. But IBM still stated that the Klepp-Johnson analysis is wrong and they only kept records of the dead people to pay death benefits, not to spot cancer traits. And they never acknowledged that they are guilty. And Richard Klepp stated that IBM had the perfect data to improve health, so to improve the perfect place to provide a safe environment for the workers. So they could have and they should have used that data. And there is many ways you can support workers, for example, doing research, how Klepp did, but there is another way, and this is activistic work. And this is what Banolim or Sharps is doing in South Korea. In 2007, Hang Sang-ki's daughter died from leukemia after working in one of Samsung's manufacturing plant. He believed that there could be a connection between Yumi's, his daughter's work, and her illness. The organization he created with a labor activist is called Banolim, translated as Supporters for Health and Rights of People in the Semiconductor Industry, shortly Sharps. Sharp's main goal is to get public insurance for all the affected people or their families. To achieve that, it's similarly very hard as it is in IBM. The affected people and their families can only get compensation of the state if they can prove the information about the chemicals that they were handling. Mostly they need to find out that information throughout court or government. Because the South Korean authorities are not willing to share this information, ratio-wise, 6 from 10 cases, trade secret is the reason of holding back the necessary information. Our fight is often against the trade secrets. Any contacts that may not work in Samsung's favor were deleted as trade secrets, said Lim Ya-won, a lawyer who represented 15 sick Samsung workers. As we know now, Samsung no longer hides the list of chemicals that they are using, but they do not share any information with which circumstances or how the people are dealing with the chemicals. So obviously legal action and activistic work is very, very important, but most important is prevention. Decentralized, self-structured, bottom-up organizations are very important to represent the needs of the workers. Those are unions. Strong independent formation are indeed very rare because it's not the interest of the companies. For example, Samsung's first union was formed by workers only in 2018 because till that time the company had a no-union policy.
So, that forming unions is greatly in the interest of the workers is quite clear, I think, not only for Samsung blue-collar workers, but any other kind of worker and laborer in general. However, if we start looking into how far companies will go to avoid and sabotage those efforts, is really a can of worms that gets messier the more you get into it. So these corporate anti-unionization strategies go a lot deeper than straight up banning unions, like we just heard with Samsung. Some ways are a lot more subtle and sometimes enforced by a lot of technological tools. So let's look a bit more general at a few examples of major Silicon Valley companies or high-tech companies to see the different modus operandi unique to the different circumstances of the companies, but then also seeing the general patterns that are shared throughout the industry. So let's start with an interview we did with Jin for a project who told us a bit about the daily working environment in the Samsung semiconductor fabrication site. So she was one of the many workers living in dorms very close to the factory, and they were working 12-hour shifts for 6 days straight and then having 2 days off. And this is disregarding the whole 7-day, Monday till Sunday week, which is, as a side effect, really desynchronizing their private lives from others like family and work unrelated friends. And in this day-to-day work, they were split into groups whose performance and daily output was tightly monitored and then compared to the other different groups. And if a performance in a group fell, the workers always had to give reason or some kind of feedback why that was. So even with the unsafe working conditions we just heard about, the environment created by Samsung in that factory made her focus solely on her performance. So to quote her, "I think I went to work every day with the idea of how to show my results today rather than fearing my health or unsafe protection." So this constant reminder of one's productivity might obviously boost the productivity for the company, being really beneficial for the corporation, but needlessly said puts a lot of mental stress onto the workers additionally to the already physical stress of the job itself. And that's only made worse by really losing touch with your work external support system and external perspective on things. So let's move on to a different example from a different company. Amazon, often referred to as one of the most influential economic and cultural forces in the world, has undoubtedly been pushing technological innovation on a mass scale worldwide. However, infamously, its very most frontline workforce in the warehouses is still infamously battling very grueling working conditions. So the workers at the Amazon fulfillment centers use certain handheld devices that give them instructions of where to pick up what item in the warehouse. And as the warehouse is sorted by an algorithm that kind of calculates the most efficient way for the items to be distributed on the shelves, it's kind of impossible for the workers to do it without this device. So they fully rely on the instructions, which provide the optimal routes for the workers to follow. However, for efficiency reasons as well, this algorithm also factors in avoiding workers to cross paths because, it goes faster than that way. This kind of further enforces the very isolating nature of the job itself already. So additionally to the constant camera surveillance, these handheld devices also monitor the workers' efficiency closely, and it also counts down the seconds it estimates that is needed for collecting each item. And each second that you take more is measured and added up to a time that is called time off task. And at some warehouses where you work for an 11.5-hour shift, you're only expected to have 18 minutes in total of time off task each day, apart from the unpaid half-hour lunchtime. But these 18 minutes include going to the bathroom, getting a drink of water, or simply taking a longer time than the algorithm kind of calculating that you would need for picking up an item. And if a worker collects too much time off task, you would of course be reprimanded by the manager for your poor performance. So Emily Gündelsberger, she worked in an Amazon fulfillment center to investigate this very experience of low-wage work, and she said, "It created a constant buzz of low-grade panic, and the isolation and monotony of the work left me feeling as if I were losing my mind." So these workers really find themselves acting as a cheap tool to aid a completely artificial and calculated algorithmic system that is incomprehensible to our human brain, and therefore are put into a very demeaning position where they're left with very little agency. And workers are essentially treated like imperfect robots, as the system does not really care if somebody's having a bad day or a tough time at home, essentially not recognizing the very human part of people. Furthermore, Amazon is making this job as low-skilled as possible, so you don't need any prior experience or training beforehand, really. This allows the company to employ the most cheap workers, including people who don't really know the language well. Fortunately for the company, this language barrier between co-workers further reduces the likeliness for a push of organization efforts by the employees. To move on to a different example, also kind of linked to these low-skilled jobs created by Uber and other food delivery services, for example, that also fall right into this pattern. That the nature of a driver or the job as a driver is not particularly social anyways. You are not really bonding with coworkers when you're on the road alone. And you're constantly moving. And these companies really fully take advantage of their individual, already distributed and scattered workers. And it's important to know that Uber and many other ride-hailing services don't employ their drivers as full-time employees. They employ them as part-time contractors and freelancers and so on. This is where a new term arises, which is called job atomization, which is where you replace long-time, full-time work that comes with benefits in the career path with occasional short-term contract gigs without any benefits or escalating career structure. And this kind of system really leaves workers vulnerable to on many levels, which is why unionization efforts have been rising, but more on that later. So Uber specifically is very obviously pushing back against this uprising movement by essentially spreading anti-unionization propaganda to their drivers. In Seattle, we had podcast episodes being released on the Uber app for the drivers to listen to. And these were pressing the narrative that the push for collective bargaining made around that time was not in the interest of Uber drivers and a threat to basically the independence of these freelance contractors and so on. And the notification linking to those episodes would stay in the bottom of the app for multiple days. So after these examples, to clearly summarize the patterns we're seeing here, we have the surveillance and the observation and the tracking of your workers and putting them under stress and keeping them isolated, and in some cases that means keeping them moving, and to atomize them as much as possible to kind of avoid community and the organization of workers.
So yeah, thanks Angie. So in the next chapter, I'm going to guide you through some further examples of how these algorithms behind these companies and inside those apps have been perfected to intricately manage the employees' lives. And yet again, we see some uncanny echoes from the past and actually just more obfuscated ways of performing similar ideas that have already happened a few decades ago. One example for that is like Frederick W. Taylor, who worked in a hydraulics factory in Philadelphia, and he was planning on establishing rules, laws, and formula which would replace the judgment of individual employees. So he wrote his book in 1911, The Principles of Scientific Management, and he came up with something he called task idea. And it basically specifies not only what is to be done, but also how it has to be done and which exact time can be allocated for the process for doing it, basically. So to give one example, a first-class shoveler would be most productive if he lifted 21 pounds of weight with every shovel load. So as a result, he designed specific shovels for each type of material. So he had a small shovel to hold 21 pounds of ore, and he manufactured a large one to hold 21 pounds of ash for the workers. And once the workers arrived at the workplace, they would be provided with papers which would tell them which tool to select and where to start work, but they would also be provided with a paper that would tell them how well they had performed on the previous day. The issue there being that most of these workers couldn't even read. So we see a very similar thing happening now with algorithms taking the place of those instruction cards and stopwatches. So as a professor from Oxford University puts it, algorithms are providing a degree of control and oversight that even the most hardened Taylorist couldn't have even dreamt of. So yeah, and also continuing on this idea of tracking and rating their workers, we're going to dive into some of the food delivery services that I guess we all very well know. So an issue there being is that the workers are not being showed the final destination until they pick up the food. So even if the ride is very uneconomical or risky in some rather dangerous neighborhoods, and you might end up refusing to deliver the customer's food, this would be really bad, and workers are usually afraid of that because they might receive a bad rating, but not by the customer, by the algorithm or the app. So in case of Uber Eats, which was launched 2016 in London, you might even be locked out of the app for over 10 minutes for canceling or missing some of these rides. So you might also be sent a monthly service level assessment, like in the case of Deliveroo, another company that was founded in 2013 in London. And it might say your average time to customer was less than your estimate, our estimate, which means you're meeting this service level criterion. Your average time difference was minus 3.1 minutes. So this would be a good message. But you also might end up getting some of those from Uber in this case. Hi there, we would like to wish you a Merry Xmas and a Happy New Year. We are currently planning for 2014 and would like you to be part of it. However, we do need to see an improvement in your current track record to ensure you are. And as the ratings had not improved 2 weeks later, the driver got deactivated. Yeah, but this idea of algorithmic management so far has only been widely applied in manufacturing and transportation. But slowly we see the same idea of algorithmic management also being applied in more traditional sectors, like retail shops or restaurants. And another good but also scary, in my opinion, example for this is the Silicon Valley-based company Percolata. They try to calculate the true productivity of a shop worker with something they call shopper yield. So they do so by installing sensors in the shops to measure the volume and type of customers flowing in and out. They even use weather and online traffic and other signals to forecast customer flows. And then they create a profile for each employee, which then creates a schedule, or the algorithm then creates a schedule with the optimal mix of workers to maximize sales for every 15-minute slot of the day. So basically what the algorithm is doing is trying to automate the manager's job. And as a result, people with higher shopper yields, they also get more hours, which again, like we heard from Angela earlier, creates a very competitive spirit in the whole company. So like the Percolata's founder basically pointed out, wouldn't it be better to just pay people for the time they're actually productive? He also suggests that retail jobs, the shop workers for instance, will become so flexible in response to fluctuating demands that they will also be part of the gig economy at some idea, which is yet another very scary idea for me. But yeah, unfortunately there are like many more such examples. Even rather trivial software like Microsoft Office, for instance, processes the employee's productivity and ultimately uploads it to the cloud. So this leaves us with the question, do we need actually a redefinition of the employment and self-employment divide? Because we see this more traditional divide not really working anymore, or at least not being beneficial for the workers. So in the case of Deliveroo, that I mentioned earlier already, the workers for that very reason have no safety net. So a worker in 2016 in London, for instance, he got knocked off his motorbike, and he was the one who had to pay for the health costs, but also the bike repair, and he additionally couldn't work for a week. And at a later point, the very same worker's contract got terminated by Deliveroo because he couldn't work because he got the flu. And in this instance, they are very much treating him as an employee, while in the earlier instance, they are saying he's self-employed, and therefore Deliveroo has no responsibilities towards him. So what we're seeing is basically the company very much picking the cherries on, or the benefits for them, but not trying to take care of their workers at all. So yeah, in other words, drivers are their own boss, yet tightly managed by the smartphones in the pocket. And the real question here being, as these algorithms actually exert so much power over the workers, shouldn't they actually be considered employees? Shouldn't they receive hourly minimum wages and should receive sick pay and also holiday pay? And yeah, I mean, as we realized by now, those algorithms really provide fantastic opportunities for rapacious exploitation of people who are already at the bottom of our labor market.
So picking up from one of the main issues of what we just heard, with these systems built on algorithms, though efficient, being really intransparent for humans to understand, therefore making it possible to put them into exploitative positions, this really fits in the more general picture that the more opaque companies are able to keep their systems, their practices and their technology, the freer they can act and the more power they have, subsequently leaving less power and agency to its own workers. So if we circle back to Samsung, this kind of obscurity and intentional convolutedness really starts at the very structure and bones of the company. Samsung the business model is called a chaebol, which is very, very common in South Korea. And chaebols are family-owned companies, or rather conglomerates, that rely on complex structures of interlocking ownership distributed within one family. This really allows kind of the official owner to leverage control of multiple subsidiaries through the help of family members and other family-owned channels. So just to give a sort of scale, the 10 biggest chaebol conglomerates in South Korea together account for more than half of the nation's total stock market capitalization. So as their success, or put the other way around, their failure would be really fatal for the whole nation, these chaebols tend to have a very close link to the government. So the Samsung Group is owned and managed by the Lee family dynasty. And after the passing of Lee Kun-hee in 2020, who was the longtime CEO of Samsung, it is now de facto led by his son, Samsung Vice Chairman J.Y. Lee. And because he's currently in jail for bribing a confidant of the South Korean former president in 2017, Samsung appointed two other co-CEOs in the most recent leadership change. However, J.Y. Lee is still very much involved in making decisions for the company through like visiting lawyers and stuff. So why it is important for us as users, consumers, and observers to be mindful of companies kind of clouding the inner workings is because we know that companies' morals and ethics only go as far as financial profitability. So losing this insight and having companies operate under complete opaqueness will ultimately always circle back and negatively affect the people. So in extreme cases, this will even lead to death. Let's just again look at a few examples of the unfortunately endless ones, which really underscore the careless lengths to which tech companies will go to dominate its market, and whilst really obscuring the nefarious ways they do to do so. So picking up again the example, I think you were too far, but of Samsung referring to trade secrets to keep any information undercover, not just from competing companies, but also from their own employees. They successfully avoid any consequences that come from this obscuring the chemical information combined with the inadequate health protection. So Samsung essentially weaponizes this trade secrecy also by hindering and blocking any legal cases built against the company later on. So Samsung leaves its employees alone to deal with the life-changing consequences of their unethical behavior. But these effects percolate further in the system to just the company's employees. In the end can really affect essentially anybody. So you might remember the VW scandal in 2015. It's relatively recent. It was also dubbed the diesel dupe, and it was basically found that the VW cars had a defeat device, or rather software installed in them, where diesel engines could basically detect when their performance was being tested, and if they found themselves in a testing situation, it changed the performance of the engines to improved results. Basically, by the help of the software, they were able to bypass the legal amount of pollutants emitted by sometimes as much as 40 times. So this lie was very beneficial for the company, but the company is not facing the side effects from this lie. Researchers estimate that the median mortality impacts from these excess emissions produced by the scam in Germany alone to be 1,200 premature deaths spread across Europe, which corresponds to 13,000 life years lost. So to really kind of prevent these situations from happening, on the one hand, we need to fight for companies to become more transparent in their inner workings. And on the other hand, we need to protect personal information and limit the amount of surveillance, collection, and usage of data collected by these companies. So this is kind of broaching into a different topic of the importance of data sovereignty and why it is so essential. Just when it comes to protecting themselves, companies will use every tool they have to do so. This also means shamelessly instrumentalizing the user data in very problematic ways for their own benefit. Uber had, a very famous habit of kind of disregarding laws and regulations to gain an edge against already established transportation providers, like the taxi services in cities, kind of generally just starting its ride-hailing services in cities without asking for permission. And so to protect themselves from government employees kind of investigating and going against these actions, they started using a tool called gradual, which was part of the program called VTOS, short for Violation of Terms of Services. And this gradual tool was basically using data it collected from the Uber app and also other techniques to root out people it thinks are using or targeting its service improperly. So, people that might harm the drivers or people from competing companies, but also government employees and officials who are trying to investigate the service. This tool is still in use today, not in all countries, but in most, underlining that we still have very much work to do and putting laws in place, kind of regulating this data collection usage. The EU has set up the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which is a step into the right direction, but as this tool is still in use, we can see that in many circumstances it is just not sufficiently enforced, this rule, leaving much room for future improvement. So ultimately, the goal here would be to resolve this unequal information distribution, so we need more corporate transparency whilst also protecting personal data.
To repeat and summarize, these companies create those systems which are very, very untransparent. If we look at Amazon warehouse jobs again, they are very dehumanizing, and in this algorithmic system, the human workers have a very little agency and put in a very vulnerable position. If we do not understand what people in power with their hands are doing, it is very, very hard to fight against them. But if we manage to understand the system built around us or our workplace, we can use the system against itself. And this is what Uber Eats drivers did to form a union in 2016. The couriers came to a brilliant idea and they logged into their apps as customers and ordered food to be delivered to them. When the other Uber Eats drivers arrived with their delivery, they found themselves in a protest where they were invited to join. So this is how algorithmic management can meet algorithmic rebellion. Thank you. And yeah, and if there is some time left, we are open for some discussions or questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about the outcome of your work? I mean, because most likely the reason why you started talking about this topic and doing artworks related to this topic, you were aiming for some sort of reaction or, I don't know, influence. So has it happened?
I think it's a mix of different things. Like, these topics are relatively complex and do not really present one clear solution or one thing that we as users of the devices in the end should do. It's a mix of trying to inform people and to think themselves about the implications behind, to not just be susceptible to kind of the media presentation of smart devices, and in cases where it can get political and you can have an influence on changes, to vote, basically. And
if I may add, I think what was quite important to us is to have sort of a hybrid in our artwork that has, where some part of it is more investigative and journalistic. Like now we really tried to more generally lay out basically strategies that are already in use. But in our work we had like the more investigative parts where we actually interviewed people and did all this research. But also a more basically working with the materiality of it and trying also to question the aesthetics and the more emotional, aesthetical and also material responses that we have to this very topic in a way. And I think that's extremely important, especially also with other topics like climate change, where we have science for decades already. I think we need to find new narrations to make those things better tangible and understandable and relatable, like emotionally, but also aesthetically. And I think that's where we as artists are in a really interesting position to overlay several lenses of research, artistic practice, and yeah, various types of media that we can like quite creatively overlay, superimpose, and yeah, work with.
Thank you. Anybody has any questions?
Do you know more examples of algorithmic rebellions?
I mean, there are many more. We have not prepared more for this topic, but there are a few books I think we could recommend. I think a very well-liked example here would be A New Dark Age by James Bridle. He has quite an extensive chapter on these sort of topics.
But yeah, I think the importance here is really, like, I think why I mean, our talk was quite really rather informative, but I think the importance here is that we really start to somehow fight against these black boxes. We really need some more transparency to even get at a point where we can basically tackle these issues, because we really see companies purposely obscuring how to understand those algorithms and boxes, so we have less agency to basically intervene and act upon those systems. So I think the key is really like a lot of communication and also trying to, yeah, really get deeper with what is behind the surface of those technologies and the whole context that is already inscribed in these rather, yeah, shiny things.
And also, there are no examples from our side, but you're invited to create an algorithmic rebellion after you know all the info. So.
Yeah, maybe to continue this lifting of the black box, could you talk a little bit about your research process? How did you get in touch with the people you interviewed? How did you deal with, I guess, language barriers, stuff like this?
Our project was started as a university project in the University of Applied Arts Vienna, and we got a brief called Bodies in Crisis, and there we were starting to, I don't know, go into this topic of colonialism, and somehow after doing quite a lot of research we found this very interesting paradox with the clean rooms and the semiconductor industry, and then in the meantime, we did this first experiment dissolving smartphones with different acids, and this is how these two things beautifully kind of fitted together. And then we started to look for people, activists or scientific researchers, and yeah, it was, to find them, it was a very long time with tons of mails to write or calls to make, but we managed. And with Korea, we had a luck that a friend of ours is originally from Korea, so she helped us with all the translation parts. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will take a short break now, about 15 minutes, and then we will welcome our next speaker, Ulises Ali Mejias.